Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say hello and thank you. I will, for those of you who are in the morning presentation, you have heard some of this, but I serve here as the Associate Director for Inclusive Excellence here at the university. And one of the things that we do, one of our major projects, is our Inclusive Excellence Transformation Awards. And this event here all day is partially funded by that. So I just wanted to say thank you and welcome. I also want to point out that Nicole's project is also another one of our Inclusive Excellence Awards. And we have a whole bunch of projects coming up. So I just encourage you to take a look at our university events calendar. We've got some stuff for people who have curly hair, a hands-on workshop for 3As to 4Cs. We've got upcoming symposium for Asian American and Pacific Islander to talk about that experience in America. We also have a AI project where students will be engaging to talk about what their views are on AI. And so I just encourage you to keep a lookout on our university calendar. And I just want to say welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you. So up next, yay. So part of this work and part of receiving funding from Inclusive Excellence is reaching out across departments and programs, right? So we have Africana Studies, we have Music and Theater, who will be here tonight. We have the library, we have Women and Gender Studies. So we have a lot going on in terms of our partnerships here with this program. And I want to make a note to my students who are in the room right now. Our next speaker is a graduate student here at UAlbany getting her PhD. And I want you to notice how she presents and what she's presenting, because as we are stepping into our conversational inquiry, this is kind of a little taste of what a conversational inquiry / review of the literature, pulling in multiple voices, sounds and looks like. Yay! So I am happy to welcome up here to the podium, Bianca Zazzarini-Leon. Yay!
Hello, my name is Bianca Zazzarini-Leon, and today I'll be presenting part of my thesis, Institutional Violence Against the Queer Community in Ciencias Ficción, or Science Fiction, by Rita Indiana. Although queer identities are marginalized politically and socially, there are authors such as Rita Indiana who highlight queer voices. Rita Indiana is a Dominican writer and musician that highlights Afro-Dominican and queer voices. Some of her work includes Science Fiction, published in 2001, and her novels, Papi from 2005, Names and Animals from 2013, and Tentacle from 2015. Her postmodern and science fiction work intersects queer social, political, and historical movements that transcend national identities and Dominican culture. Rita Indiana is considered a Dominican queer icon, as not many Dominicans at her level of fame are as queer or even queer themselves. Her work crosses gender boundaries and crosses borders between various genres of literature to submerge us in palpable realities of the Caribbean. Indiana explores how most Dominican authors appropriate queer art aesthetics in their writing, yet continuously leave them out. However, Rita Indiana centers LGBTQ+ identities in her work. Indiana also focuses on the dictatorship of Trujillo from 1930 to 1961 and his, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yes. Sorry. And his successor, Joaquin Balaguer, from 1965 to 1996, which created a homogenous culture categorized by rigid binaries, racism, and violence, which Indiana questions to conceptualize a new Dominican identity. These rigid gender binaries consider a man is not a real man unless he is heterosexually active and instead remains a boy or a male. In the deliberate construction of these pairings is an implicit superior-inferior meaning, and they are used as agents of social control. Furthermore, in the chapter Science Fiction and Queer Theory by Pearson in the Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction, she discusses the idea that sexuality is rigid because traditionally it highlights heteronormative practices and focuses on the idea that sexuality is there to uphold patriarchal heteronormative ideals. Yet here, Indiana shifts the narrative through scientific discourse. She challenges social ideals of queerness and cleanliness and recognizes the artists and their art. In the Dominican Republic, LGBTQ plus voices are silenced and marginalized while their lives are used to further the corruption already taking place in the Dominican Republic. However, Rita Indiana doesn't shy away from highlighting queer voices. In her collection of short stories, Ciencia Succión, published in 2001, Rita Indiana illustrates the dehumanization and erasure of the queer community. Her literature legitimizes marginalized persons and challenges the status quo, expanding border representation of gender sexuality, which bridge the gap between high and low culture, making other bodies legible. In her short story, In the House, Rita Indiana writes of the Dominican Republic during the Trujillo dictatorship from 1930 to 1961, which was categorized by rigid gender norms and brutality against the LGBTQI community. And her short story features where she highlights a trans person's systemic erasure during their transition. She highlights how Dominicans are a product of the Trujillo dictatorship, yet he will not accept queer art as part of the national Dominican discourse. This negative response is because of the shift away from Dominican aesthetics that define Dominicanness. That is, unsaid codes of Dominican male dress, musical taste, and so on, towards a hybrid aesthetics. Dominicanness is legally and socially defined. Laws are put in place in order to curate the ideal Dominican upheld by social values. Yet queer theory contests the hegemonic representations of patriarchal culture that does not recognize its others. Like other critical discourses, it works to create a critical distance between observer and observed, to defamiliarize certain taken for granted aspects of ordinary human reality, denaturalizing situations of historical inequity and or oppression that otherwise may appear inevitable to us, if indeed we notice them at all. Rita Indiana depicts the reality of queer peoples in the Dominican Republic and their social and legal oppression, while addressing how they must negotiate their identity and belonging to the national Dominican discourse. In her short stories, features, and In the House, Indiana highlights queer realities socially and legally while highlighting the legal violence that the LGBTQIA community faces. Through legal acceptance, queer bodies will not be othered and excluded from conversations of Dominicanness. They will be a part of the dominant culture. The injustices that occur legally can be seen in the treatment of the people in the LGBTQIA community, under the Constitution and in different laws. The LGBTQIA community is discriminated against legally by being arrested under the guise of prostitution. And socially, many Dominicans value heterosexual relationships, so much so that it is in the Constitution that marriage is defined between man and woman. Although certain representation is allowed in the media, such as drag queens for entertainment, trans and homosexual identities are not seen as a respectable way to live. This categorically defines what it is to be Dominican in terms of legality. The Dominican nation is an integral part of how Dominican bodies and how they are defined by national policies shaping national belonging, defining those who fit within a particular national project and those who do not. Their bodies articulating belonging, yet socially and politically are rejected as part of the Dominican culture, of the dominant culture, The construction of gender identity and norms were imposed by the dictator Trujillo, who imposed rigid norms in Dominican society. Dominicans also have a complex way of categorizing who is homosexual as a gay man who takes an active role in sex is not considered gay or effeminate, but a man who takes on a passive role is considered gay. Furthermore, under Law 285-66, it is illegal for any law enforcement, including the military, to be part of the LGBTQIA community, and any conduct of same-sexual activity is punishable under Article 210 of that very same law, from 6 months to up to 2 years in prison. This hostile environment against the LGBTQIA community has allowed police to openly discriminate against them through illegal arrests and extortion. These illegal arrests are typically for prostitution, whether they are engaging in it or not, yet allowing tourists who do participate not to be arrested. Moreover, under Article 187 of the Penal Codes, it is legal to discriminate openly against people in the LGBTQIA community, meaning that persons, for example, cannot work in certain stores or even shop there. Other marginalizing acts that are allowed because of this article are reconversion therapy. It is illegal to change genders or your name on any medically and on any government official documents. However, it is through transition that the body and identity cannot hide and shape representation in the Dominican Republic. In her short story, In the House, Indiana uses the house as a metaphor for the Dominican Republic and what happens under Trujillo's dictatorship to the LGBTQIA community. In this time period, totalitarianism dominated with violence and repression, categorizing Dominican politics, which is depicted when it states, "There are the most orgiastic parties of 3 days in which we throw the boss through the window. Intimate get-togethers to fire artists and celebrities of the gay scene. Parties in which we killed 2 fags with 1 shot. All of our productions are bought about with the most scientific hygiene." The first reference of the orgiastic parties is to the dictator Trujillo, who would force celebrations to him to occur for lengthy periods of time, a party that occurred on the night of his death where he was shot through his car window. However, when Indiana states, "get together to fire artists," she is referring to how Dominican institutions appropriate and use queer art, yet do not want queer artists forming part of the institutions. Many queer artists are not accepted as forming part of the dominant culture. However, this is mainly because of the extreme views which oscillate of queer folk as pedophiles, people ridden with AIDS, or even underground cultures. Furthermore, she highlights the violence that the LGBTQIA community faces by stating that they killed 2 fags with 1 shot. Socially and legally, murder during this time by the police was normal. These murders stole art from the queer community without the person's sexuality coming to light. Legally speaking, the police would not investigate, and it is common for many people in the LGBTQIA community to be murdered without justification, with no one being punished for their crimes. Indiana here is criticizing the use of queer art and queer subjects to further Dominican culture, yet excluding them to the point of murder because the elites and the upper middle class do not see them as belonging, illustrated when she states that the production is hygienic. Indiana uses scientific discourse to combat the irrational fears of the Dominican elite that the art and the artist are not unhygienic for their sexuality. It is through this scientific discourse where Indiana reclaims queer art and artists as part of Dominican culture. Queer artists have largely produced art for the culture with no recognition and erasure of their accomplishments and art. In the Dominican Republic, being out and proud about homosexual identity has ruined professional careers and has socially allowed people to openly discriminate against people in the LGBTQIA community. In her short story Features, Indiana addresses the transition of a trans person from male to female while their identity is erased legally. In this distant future, the government will have control over one's social security and can claim or reject their citizens. This is shown by the erasure of Suzuki's social security picture, demonstrated when it states, Suzuki's social security photo is erasing. One sees her social security for identification, and the only thing that can be identified are references, marital status, temperament, and hair. She eats her nails. The photo started to disappear 2 years ago when Suzuki realized. Now the signs are not recognizable and has a different whistle for each one of her bodies. Looking at Suzuki's social security and only identifying references, which refers to a fragmented source of Suzuki's identity, as the picture is erased, leaving basic information such as marital status, temperament, and hair color as the only identifiers. The institutions in the Dominican Republic have mainly been legitimized by men who seek to define what is Dominicanness. Dominicanness is understood through policies, which are used to define nationally the Dominican Republic and Dominican identity, which is heteronormative and does not recognize trans persons as part of the diaspora. Suzuki's transition is riddled with anxiety since she continuously bites her nails. In her chapter, Desde la Orilla, Fighting for Queer Identity in the Dominican Republic, Talaj states how trans identities such as transvestite, transsexual, and transgender are not accepted by the upper and middle classes because of their association with AIDS, pedophilia, voodoo, dark-skinned rural Dominicans, and again, underground movements. In many rural parts of the Dominican Republic, and practitioners of voodoo celebrate trans and homosexual identities. But because of the negative associations with religion and classism, homosexuality and trans identities are associated with what is being known as a chusma, which is a negative word used to mean low-class people who behave in unacceptable manners. Moreover, her transition is marked as not perceivable in this current time frame. People in the LGBTQIA community also face discrimination in education, housing, and access to healthcare, which has disproportionately affected the trans community. As mentioned above, being out and proud about your trans or homosexual identity has ruined familial relationships, professional careers, and has allowed medical staff to openly discriminate against people in the LGBTQIA community. However, it is in Suzuki's transition that they are shown physically confident while their legal identity is erased and is incomplete. Legally, she will never be recognized for who she is. It is also important to note that Dominican identity adheres to strict gender norms. Men took on public roles and were expected to be virile, while women took on a passive role and stayed in the domestic sphere. Although in the sense of Dominicanness, trans persons are excluded legally, Rita Indiana emphasizes their Dominicanness through legal acceptance. Socially, trans people are marginalized because they do not fall into a rigid binary, and Indiana highlights acceptance mainly through legal means by stating that when they remember, they forget about the Social Security. Their nails grow and they paint them. They put on boobs and start posing. The only thing missing is a camera. Indiana first creates a third space between identity and belonging. This third space created first as the Social Security card and as a space of belonging, while not having the Social Security depicts a space of non-belonging. This third space is her own body, a space familiar to many queer Dominicans where many negotiate their identity of Dominicanness and belonging, which is further emphasized by Suzuki's gender performance. Suzuki's gender performance is drag, and if it is an imitation that regularly produces the ideal, it attempts to approximate, then gender is a performance that produces the illusion of an intersex, or essence, or psychic gender core. It produces on the skin through the gesture, the move, the gait, that array of corporeal theatrics understood as gender presentation, the illusion of an inner depth. Essentially, the body performs gender as a constructed identity used to negotiate belonging or non-belonging. This is emphasized with Suzuki putting on 2 breasts and posing. Suzuki as a woman is negotiating whether to be a part of the dominant culture or not. Suzuki does reject the dominant space by not updating her Social Security, which seems to depict the struggle with how to perform their own often non-conforming gender identities. It is actually the unnamed friend there with Suzuki who states that the only thing missing is a camera. Here, there's an acceptance that this person has the Dominicanness to participate in the dominant culture from which they are excluded from. In this way, Indiana has recentered the queer person who is typically excluded from the diaspora as an important aspect of the culture who does belong. In conclusion, Rita Indiana criticizes Dominican institutions which exclude queer artists yet appropriate their art. This exclusion is by the elites and the middle class who view trans and homosexual bodies as not belonging and associating them with extreme views of AIDS, voodoo, pedophilia, lower class, and dark-skinned Dominicans. Indiana uses scientific discourse to reclaim queer art and artists as producing clean art to combat the stigma that has been placed upon them. In this way, she negotiates their identity as belonging to the dominant culture from which they are typically erased. Moreover, Indiana recenters queer persons in Dominican narratives. She highlights Suzuki and her erasure from the dominant culture by her picture erasing every year. Yet Suzuki must create a third space through her body to oppose the rigid binaries created by Trujillo and continued by his successor, Joaquin Balaguer. In her body, Suzuki negotiates her belonging to the national Dominican identity, an identity that paves the way for new bodies and sexualities to be centered. Suzuki, through her transition, is allowed to claim a diaspora that socially and legally tried to exclude her. Thank you.
Any questions? Anyone have any questions they might want to ask, comments, thoughts?
Yes.
So what encouraged you to write about this specific topic? Was it something that you grew up with around you and you were just questioning where it came from? Or was it something more of like, oh, I'm seeing what's happening around me now, so I wonder if that's where my descendancy also happened to come from?
No, I'm Dominican. And so I saw that there was like always very rampant homophobia and I couldn't understand why. And so I was researching and looking, and this is what I found. Yes.
I have a question about Dominicans who are both dark-skinned Dominicans and members of the LGBTQIA community. Have you had any discourse with those individuals about what it feels like to be doubly discriminated against and oppressed?
No, I've only seen what the newspaper articles have written about them, and I felt I didn't want to impose myself by reaching out, especially when I saw what had already been written about them. Yes.
What is the reception of Indiana's work in the Dominican Republic been?
She's not the most celebrated because she does highlight Afro-Dominican and queer voices. They recognize her as a Dominican author, but there is a little pushback with her regarding her work.
Just a follow-up question. I wondered if it is safer to do that work, the work that she is doing through fiction. Do you think, is that a strategy or is that simply the art that she makes?
I think it's simply the art that she makes. Rita Indiana is herself very queer, and she left the Dominican Republic to be able to write these stories. So, yeah.
Are there no changes in the Dominican Republic regarding LGBTQA? I mean, like even in Cuba, like during the beginning of the revolution, people always talked about that this was the case with Cuba. They were anti this and that. But even today, like Mariela Castro, she's part of the movement to bring this discourse and bring more equity and to the gay and lesbian community in Cuba, and they've made profound changes. And so I'm just asking, there's no changes at all in the Dominican Republic regarding this topic?
There is a movement, but it's not looked upon favorably, and it's really dangerous to actually protest and be LGBTQ and go out, for example, for like Pride Month. So it's more so navigated by Dominicans in New York, but not many Dominicans in the diaspora. It's not really safe for them to celebrate, but they do celebrate when they can. Yes.
How would you say that this informed how you define identity? Would you say that it says that institutions should only look kind of from the outside, or would you say that it means that identity has like this wide definition?
I think it means identity has a wide definition, but also it shows how institutions kind of create their own idea of what it is to be a Dominican citizen. For example, in the Dominican Republic, to be a Dominican citizen, you have to be essentially a heterosexual couple living together and going out and doing the Lord's work. And if you leave that identity, you're excluded from the dominant narrative. Oh, yes?
Thank you very much. I was wondering if anyone, like Dominican LGBT activists, have connected with Zanele Mapoli, who's in South Africa, who documents the lives of LGBT in film and has these big great art installations in Europe and all over. I just wondered if there's any connection with other countries.
Mainly the US, like US Dominicans and Dominicans that are queer in the Dominican Republic, they connect, but I haven't heard of them connecting with anyone from South Africa or other countries. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you so much.